Good afternoon, everyone. So excited to be chairing this Spaces webinar today about social responsibility in sports and how we are addressing ethics, social value and human rights, and is it working? Before I introduce the panel, just a very quick intro to me and BASIS. So I'm Amanda Curtis. I'm an independent sustainability practitioner focusing on food, sports and events. And I'm currently working for the ATP Tennis Tour, M&S and some other retailers. I'm also on the board of BASIS. And I joined after leading the sustainability programme for the venues and operations at the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So that means BASIS is a little over 10 years old. And we are a hub for the UK sports industry. We're a network of experienced operational and sustainability managers and experts, and we're committed to delivering positive impact in sport at every level, not just the top events, but down in community levels as well. And we do that by sharing best practice, developing content that shapes the sustainability debate, as well as being an advocate for the policy environment that enables a sustainable sport. This is part of the monthly webinar series, so check out the others if you haven't seen them already. We've got an amazing panel today, so if you give us a wave when I introduce you quickly. We've got Steve Gibbons, and he's founding director of Ergon Associates, and he's a leader in business and human rights with huge experience of implementing human rights in sports federation clubs and venues. We've got Hala El Auster, an accessibility and diversity manager at FIFA. And she's also an established campaigner for equality, diversity and inclusion within sports. And she also led the Scottish FA's Equality Standard and sits on the board of Women in Football. So I'm sure there'll be lots of really good questions for both of those. And we also have Jess Palalashi. She's a leading diversity and inclusion practitioner for corporates and the creative industry. She's also a founding member of the Inter-Island Collective, which is a misfit collection of queer Moana artists and activists around the world. Yeah, a special thanks to Jess because she's currently about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand. We'll be able to start by giving each of the panel members a chance to give a quick intro as well to get the discussion started. But I want this to be a really informal event, and a chatty discussion. So use the chat function and ask questions, and I'll try and weave those in after the initial panel questioning. And also I think it would be really nice to kind of just know where you are in the social responsibility world, kind of what your focus is on, if there's any areas within that you want us to kind of concentrate our discussions on. And I think it's just really, part of that is there's so many areas of social responsibility field. I mean, it's diverse in itself, from community, pay, equality, health and well-being, human rights, child safeguarding, the supply chain, athlete abuse, and that's just to kind of name a few. And it has been really in the news recently. Just an hour ago, there was the football sexual abuse report that finds that ignorance, naivety and absence of child protection policies. There's also, as you know, kind of the violence and abuse against women and girls in particular over the last week. The Equality and Human Rights Commission asked to conduct an investigation into racism in English cricket. But then on the positive side, we had Rachel Blackmore win she was the first female to win the champion hurdle at Cheltenham yesterday. So that's really exciting. So I will now hand over to the panel because they've got all the fantastic experience and wealth of knowledge. And Steve, I'll start with you. If you could just give a bit of a background about kind of where this fits in the wider sustainability agenda as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks so much for inviting me to join you today. I'll just briefly explain sort of, who I am and what we do and where it relates to sport and a few thoughts, and then obviously come back in on the discussion. But as Amanda said, I'm founding director of Ergon, and we're a business and human rights consultancy, and we kind of work with business and finance and a whole range of others, including quite a few sports actors, looking at how they might both minimize and reduce the chances and negative impacts on human rights, but also promote positive human rights issues in the broadest sense as well. And that could be, as you said, from labour practices through gender issues, through to cultural practices, through to land. And we're about a group of about 20 odd people based in London and Spain and Netherlands. And my colleague, Louise Nichols, I think is somewhere hovering out amongst the boxes on the screen. And in particular, as far as sport is concerned, we've had a number of defined engagements. One was designing and then managing the supply chain sustainability and human rights grievance mechanism for London 2012. We worked with the 3 FA member association bid as human rights experts for Mexico, USA and Canada for 2026. We've been working with Hala and her colleagues in Qatar on remedy. We've been working with the Bundesliga on human rights, and then a whole range of others, including sponsors and other actors who relate to sport. And we're currently working with Birmingham 2022 on their human rights strategy. When I say that, it feels very close. One of the key things we see is that some of the lessons that are outside, as the way that some progressive businesses and large UN organizations and NGOs like Oxfam and World Wildlife Foundation are carrying out sort of assessment of human rights, is really important for sport. And that's really an approach to actually, you can quite often chase issues. And I think the Sheldon report we've just seen for the FA is both distressing, but also unfortunately not surprising as far as the abuse of young players and children in football through the 70s and 90s, even through to 2005. But also, I think it's really important that sport sees its power. And in that, it means, and we've got starting to get this, and I think Amanda mentioned it already, to kind of assess where are there ways in which, let's start negative and go positive, to be sort of end all optimism. But where are the places that potentially negatively sports, whether it's an elite mega sporting event or it's grassroots day-to-day practice, is where you negatively affect people, and identifying those people. And those can be, obviously they can be athletes at different levels. Obviously they can be fans and they can be communities. They can also be, for example, they can be workers very diverse from the event. So for example, between the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games in 2012, I had to get on a plane to go to the Philippines to do a labor mediation in Adidas factories that were supplying for the Games. Now, as far as talking to the unions and those workers and the factory owners, they, what they were making was no different. If it was a T-shirt that was being made to be sold in Gap and a T-shirt that was being made to be sold with the merch and the logo of London 2012, the process was no different. But the really interesting thing, which is I think flips to the positive side of this, is the power was astronomical of the fact, and I think Hala and her colleagues would say this as far as FIFA, and I think we'd concur with this actually, the power of sport and people wanting to engage in the positive sort of dimensions of sport, and the ability of sport, if it gets its game right, to promote human rights and social change is enormous. And not just because you get people's attention, and not just because there's money behind this, because of course the core principles of sport are positive. I mean, that's why we all play sport and engage in sport, because it's a positive and it's a good thing. And I think, the same example could be some of the changes we've seen in Qatar are quite astronomical and unpredicted, but of course the outside narrative is quite often still negative. So I think what I'd leave on this is there's an emerging way to understand how sport impacts on human rights, where it does, what we can do to, in partnership individually, whether it's a club, a federation or others working with NGOs, governments, but also is how we build in the narrative. And I think, as we all know, issues around what Marcus Rashford's, personal leadership role in this, issues around Black Lives Matter and the change in sport over 2 years, and club owners, which was astronomical again, just literally it's sort of a 360 change on this to say we should be promoting positive values is a great thing, but then we have to start implementing. And I think that's the lessons from sustainability. Human rights needs science, and it needs management systems, and it needs checklists, and it needs us to treat it as actually something that we hardwire into the way we deliver on a day-to-day basis. So I'll shut up for a minute now. Yeah.
Well, you've inspired lots of questions from me in what you've said there, but we'll hand over to Hala now.
Yeah, maybe just to give a bit of context and background as well. Diversity and Accessibility Manager at FIFA, and that's predominantly focused on diversity internally, moving that along, and accessibility at wider tournaments. So I guess the topic of human rights for us, it's mostly regarded to the social aspects, to safeguard and ensure those equal opportunity access for different groups. It's a wide range of groups that human rights covers, and it really covers the full event cycle for us as part of an international organisation delivering tournaments. So that can be from the bidding stage all the way to the strategy planning, to the implementation. And I guess for me specifically, a key part of that is accessibility for disabled people, and people with limited mobility is what I predominantly work on. So I guess in that context as well, with regards to those groups, there's really key things to look for as part of that process. Key things to focus on, such as making sure the infrastructure can be accessible for disabled people and people with limited mobility. You have the right services in place to make sure that it is inclusive for everyone, and also just assessing the key parts, I guess, which is relevant for any topic, especially diversity and inclusion, is the operational procedures and policies to make sure that the setup, the background context is running well to be able to implement, like Steve mentioned, with those to support. So again, it's difficult for us being a global and international organisation and hosting tournaments around the world. There's a lot of principles and aspects we need to consider, such as local and national legislation, and whether in terms of the principles of diversity and inclusion, which of those are we pushing? We need to also respect the traditional and cultural contexts, as we've seen in Qatar and in different places. So that's also something that's quite important. But then we also have our requirements as FIFA that we expect as a minimum standard when we go into these different hosting nations for them to be able to abide by and to implement as required by FIFA. And probably in any aspect, the most important is stakeholder engagement. It's speaking to people, it's really understanding from people, from ourselves and themselves, coming to compromises, but really getting it right together and using that collaborative approach to move things forward, and pushing things and advancing things forward. Another area, I guess, from my background, and I don't know if you've guessed from my accent, working in the Scottish National Association, the internal piece around human rights and staff rights, employee rights within an association. I guess I was working in diversity and inclusion from boardroom down to dressing room, and really trying to embed the principles of diversity and inclusion across all those different areas, from a HR perspective, but a wider CSR perspective as well within the clubs. And I have seen quite an advancement, and I know in terms of a basis is predominantly focused in the UK, and all UK governing bodies have to work towards this equality standard framework. And that's something I guess I was proud to lead Scotland to make sure that we were one of the first football associations to get that advanced level of that, but not just stop there. Make sure that the principles are embedded beyond I left, beyond me leaving them, and then to continue those as well. And just lastly, my board participation with women in football is something I'm quite passionate about as well. And I think that's probably something we can pick up during the conversation, just to make sure in terms of the role of gender equality from a governance perspective, as well as participation, is something that's quite important and considered as an important human right.
Thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you. And I think in terms of FIFA's kind of, I guess, priorities, how is it seen within FIFA in particular? Is there a particular focus area just on the human rights, or is this kind of diversity, inclusion, accessibility piece quite, I suppose, quite well respected and known and trying to be implemented across all the tournaments?
It's key for FIFA. I mean, we have a dedicated department, Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Department, which I sit as part of. We have our head of human rights and the human rights policy, which was implemented in 2016. It sits as part of our statutes. It's part of our vision, our corporate strategy of bringing the game to all. I mean, the introduction of our roles as well, being able to push this for tournaments and counterparts in each of these local entities working on this topic in the local and national context is key. It's important, and you'll see it throughout in terms of tournament structures and bidding phases, hosting phases. It's a key criteria that we implement and look for and work with the nations. And Steve, I guess, has a lot of experience preparing the host cities and host nations in terms of bidding for such tournaments, and we'll have a lot of experience, I guess, to share as well.
And before we go on to that, just over to Jess, and just kind of your experience from kind of major corporates and universities and the creative industry. Is change happening around these human rights areas and diversity and inclusion, and kind of what needs to be done?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just wanted to say ata Māori, which is good morning in Māori. I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm in New Zealand in Aotearoa, and I'm aware of the presence of the tangata whenua here, which is, of course, the Māori people. So I think there's some really great things that have been raised already, just in terms of where we are. I think the first thing that I always sort of ask myself is, who isn't in the room, and I know that we work in sort of Zoom rooms at the moment, so it's sometimes less obvious, when you're in meetings and, in the old days, you would sort of look around the room and say, does this room, everybody might look the same or have a lot of the same experiences, similar backgrounds. So I think one of the questions I always ask myself is who isn't here? Because that person that isn't there is an absence of voice. Which you think, can actually be really important in terms of some of these really, really complex and, we're really speaking to personal values here, which may be in contradiction to how people, what their personal experience was, how they grew up, what their ethics and values are. I think broadly as humans, we know that there are things that are inherently wrong that we want to make sure that we're preventing. But, I think some of these things around human rights or the social aspects of sustainable sort of practices can be really challenging because a lot of our things might be quite historical in the way in which they've been embedded. And I guess the other thing is to always think about if the space or the room or the event was inclusive, it would by nature be diverse. So I think we use diversity and inclusion as a pairing, but it's actually the inclusive part that's most important, because that will drive the diversity just by the nature of how we think about things. So when we are creating events or we're working in partnership with people, it's always about, creating an inclusive space that will therefore, welcome in more diverse voices, more diverse experiences. And I think one of the things that I really picked up from what Steve was saying too is the power of sport is similar to the power of arts. So I think what we've inherently turned to in sort of the last year and a half has been, what are those things that we can still hold on to that inspire us, that sort of give us hope and things like that. And the arts and sport are very similar in that way, in terms of being able to, I guess, transcend, and yeah, you can tell I'm from an arts background. I'm already talking about transcending spaces, but I think one of the things I just really want to hone into is the importance of language, and that's really key for stakeholder engagement. But as well, like I've worked in sustainability for many years. For me, sustainability, but also diversity and inclusion is about storytelling. It's about what is the narrative, what are you trying to express, how are you trying to do that? What is the vehicle of communication, especially when you're dealing with humans? We love stories. We want to understand who people are, where they've come from, but also I think it's a really powerful tool in terms of, I guess, highlighting, problematic practices, but also changing the narrative, and I think there are some really key people, globally, especially in the sports world, who are doing that. But also my experience is I think there's an appetite for change, but I think we get stuck in this idea of it being a bolt-on. It has to be really, really embedded, just like sustainability is. And also it can't be performative or tokenistic. It has to be authentic. Otherwise people won't, get on board. You really need to be able to, it's not always, it's not a sort of a conviction, but there is a a real need for the top person, so that, you know, these key leaders to really drive it and be shown to. So it's about not just the words, but the actions as well. So yeah, so I hope that's answered some of what you were saying, Amanda. And yeah, I'm happy to sort of keep going. But also, you know, just want to hand it over to the rest of the panel.
You made some really, really lovely points there. And I think, you know, the who isn't in the room, I think is probably something for BASES to consider. You know, who's in their membership, who are they speaking to? Have we got full representative across all the different spaces within sport appropriately? And probably some work to do there within the BASES organisation as well. And I think that's something we can all ask ourselves wherever we work. Steve, just kind of drawing on from some of what's Jess said in particular, and being needing to be led from the top. And I guess from your experience, have you seen that happening, and is it effectively being embedded within some of these major organizations effectively?
Yes and no. Okay, so I think I absolutely agree, Jess, as far as being led from the top, but also I think we're talking about some difficult things, and we're talking about lots of social change. And I think basically, if it is purely led from the top, I'm suspicious, right? That's where leaders say, oh yes, I understand this, you know, I'm fine, you know, I will let you people, whoever you people are, now take part in this. I think you need external pressure. And I think the power of potential protest, and the power, you know, we've seen this with Black Lives Matter and its impact on sport. I mean, to be honest, if you look at the change, and Hala raised the work we did around the 2026 bid, which for FIFA Men's World Cup, and the same principles apply to the FIFA Women's World Cup, which was a year later. But each host sort of bid has to have a human rights strategy, has to have expertise, and go through that. Now, if I'm honest, you know, that wasn't, you know, Gianni Infantino saying one day, you know, I'm going to lead FIFA into a new world of human rights. There was a whole load of people outside who were constantly saying FIFA had to up its game. Sorry to mix the metaphor, it won't be the last. But is that, you know, so it was that outside which forces leadership to do things. And certainly, if I'm honest as well, I think we can be, as far as the work that we did with London 2012, because when the sustainability team, and Amanda, you were part of it, it was a great sustainability team, but it was an environmental sustainability team. You know, it wasn't a social impact sustainability team, it wasn't a human rights sustainability team. And we kind of came in late, i.e. 3 years out, partly because the trade unions and NGOs were constantly sort of hitting the leadership of London 2012, saying, you need to show leadership by doing something about human rights, in this case, in relation to labour rights, more generally in the supply chain. So first thing I think the response to the question was, leadership is really important, but I don't think you get change just by leadership. I think leaders often in the sports world are forced into change because, again, being totally honest, you know, there's a lot of conservatism in sport as well, yeah, and there is a lot of decision-making processes. I always say to my colleagues, and I'm a lawyer in long and hard recovery, but is that if we work with some clients, let's say, you know, Amanda, if you're there, and Jess and Louise as well, when we're working with M&S, essentially Marks and Spencer's operates in almost not a rule-free environment, but a very low rule environment. If you can make the case for something, you can kind of do it. Yeah, fair enough, within reason. Yeah. Whereas I think the thing about sports is sports by its nature is just full of rules. You know, both from, you know, the way the game is played at its core, and then, you know, as we know, lots of structures, lots of committees, lots of organizations. So I think it's kind of getting through that to the right leaders that can take risks and do things to actually open up questions, which are hard to ask sometimes, because you, back to your point, Jess, and I just want to raise this, and I'll shut up, but, you know, that issue of who's not in the room, and also where the power lies. I mean, just personally, I think, you know, professional football and also professional basketball are two good examples here, because if you look at the way they both work, and they probably are, with argue about cricket, but probably the world global really big influencing sports. I think that's probably fair to say in numbers, in terms of financially and cultural impact, is that, you know, there are sports where, you know, young Black working class men and women can become very rich in a way, and very powerful if they, based on their skill, and have access to that in a way that hardly any other part of the world or life is possible. But then it gets to the situation, I think your comparison with the arts and music and media just really good. If you've got similarly an incredible sort of rock star, say, yeah, or a jazz musician, if he or she makes a political statement, nobody is surprised, and nobody tells them you can't make that statement. Whereas if, you know, somebody like Marcus Rashford, if a young Black man makes a political statement, everyone is questioning how do they dare have the right to do that? Whereas those are the people who demonstrate leadership, because as we know, you know, if you're talking about sort of getting to young men to understand issues about gender-based violence, which obviously in the UK, you know, if we look what's happened over the last 2 weeks, if we look at the police force, if you had, and there is a certain element of it, but if you had, for example, leading football players and leading rugby players, I'll say for the police force, for defined reasons, making really clear statements about gender-based violence and the acceptance of gender-based violence, we could start seeing some change and really seeing the power of sport. So we want to get back to the sort of the basics of how you organize a sporting event, but I just want to throw that out because that power thing is super powerful, because quite often sports people, I talk about it for the gender-based violence, because male sporting figures have incredible sexual privilege, and they have that from the moment they emerge as talent. And we could really do something, you know, as far as actually working with male elite athletes to really knock a hole in some of these really challenging issues. And I think we miss our opportunity if we don't do that.
Yeah, no, I think Steve raised a really good point. And I think too, like, a lot of it is grassroots and the top, and then you sort of meet in the middle, where sometimes that is where some of the key issues are, you know, in terms of that middle management. I especially, you know, sort of aware of that in corporate, that you may have a really aspirational leader at the top, but you need to make sure that there is a trickle down of some of those philosophies. And it's not just about sort of saying the right thing and you know, making sure that, you know, especially around the Black Lives Matter stuff around the summer, you know, a lot of performative allyship was seen, you know, in terms of, you know, Black squares on Instagram and things like that. But, you know, there has to be something behind it, and there will be pressure from the bottom if we're talking about a hierarchy, which is also, I think, similar to an external pressure. I think, you know, one of the things that we need to sort of keep thinking about though is, you know, this external pressure is, you know, it's a lot of work for other people who are usually the ones who are most disadvantaged. You know, so when you think about the Black Lives Matter protest, that is Black people who are already having a lived experience of racism on a daily basis, who are then having to go out and protest for their lives to matter effectively, you know. And so it's about how do we take some of that burden off those who are already probably part of a marginalized group or a minority voice, to actually allow some of the majority culture to do some of the work, you know. And that's not just a flippant, glib comment about what the work is, but I think it's around, you know, there's an individual responsibility here for collective change. And so I think, you know, that is also really powerful about what are you doing as an individual to ensure that, you know, we are, you know, doing, I think, making the change possible, rather than sort of waiting, you know, for it to be led all the time. We saw some really great examples at M&S of people, customer assistants, who really forced some of the, you know, hard discussions with the executive team. And that was just because they purely, it was a leap of faith, you know, and just like, actually, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to go straight to the top. So, you know, I think that, you know, there are some real examples of people who are doing that. And yeah, Colin Kaepernick is another one, of course, who, you know, who really stuck to his values, and then obviously doesn't play any longer. So yeah, I mean, I think there are some really similar examples in the arts and in sport, but yeah, there is a lot more at stake, I think, in terms of capitalism and trying to keep that money machine going in sport a lot more than in the arts. Yeah.
And just to add in, Amanda, which I think probably goes to Hella as well, I want to say, you know, I think the work that football has done on racism is actually kind of exemplary and something that we should look to, on some broader issues on there. Because again, I think, as someone who until recently, used to go and, every week go and sit amongst fans inside the Emirates Stadium, which certainly inside Highbury at times you'd hear racism every week, and you'd certainly hear anti-Semitism every week, and it was super uncomfortable. Whereas now, one of the last times in the stadium was that there was an anti-Semitic comment behind us, and 8 of us turned around and felt confident to challenge. So I think, football has changed, quite significantly on that issue.
And there's quite a few things that come into my head. I'd love to come back to the athlete activism piece, and I know a few athletes are listening, so it'd be interesting to get your views. But kind of when you were talking about the governance and the rules, and I suppose partly there what you're mentioning around FIFA is that having, was that led by some governance and ruling that then the fans kind of adopted that as well? And I don't know, Hala, if you can kind of draw in both from the FIFA experience but also from the women in football.
I mean, I guess we're talking about, leadership in terms of top-down approach, but it is so crucial to have the bottom-up approach. Sports by nature is competitive at all levels, and leverage is one of my favourite words within working within sports, and it's so powerful to get things moving and to advance things. And we see it with, for example, the conversations about LGBT rights in Qatar, or whether it's we had a campaign with women in football, the hashtag What's If campaign, and that was really challenging organisations, athletes, individuals, corporations to make pledges towards advancing the topic of gender equality within the industry. And the type of things that came out of that really organisations started competing against each other to see who could do more. It moved things forward, but it also works within the sports context. When I was at Scottish FA, there was no diversity and inclusion manager at UEFA or at FIFA. And that really, I think, was led from the bottom, from the member associations pushing and saying, this is an important topic on the ground. This is what's happening with the clubs, with the national associations. This is the type of topics that are being talked about in our nations and we need addressed. And I think showing the successes at a national level obviously pushed that and used that leverage to work at a higher level. I mean, within the tournaments as well, it's something that the FIFA are open to. We had our Human Rights Advisory Board as well, with externals and experts from different industries, not only the sports industries, but recognising that the topic of diversity and inclusion and human rights goes beyond sports. It's a societal topic that's important, and that we need to be aware of that and obviously take the best practice and learnings from different industries to be able to evolve the topic in our own industry. So I think definitely key leverage, bottom up, pushing, and externals is something that's really important to get the topic going forward. And really, I think Jessica hit the nail on the head when she talked about, it's nice to have the diversity aspect. Sometimes it naturally exists within FIFA. Obviously, from a staff perspective, we have diversity. My manager herself is self-confessed in terms of lesbian. She's also a wheelchair user and female within sports. But really, it's not just about having them included as part of the mix of diversity. It's having them really be given the decision-making powers and really powerful positions within the industry or within the organisation to be able to push that agenda forward for the rest. And I know, Jessica, completely agree. It's usually left in terms of with the minorities to push to make the change, which is something that's not fair. So I think that's definitely a calling, not just to organisations, but like Jessica said, individual calling for each of us to be able to challenge what's happening for everyone, whether it's women, whether it's ethnic minorities, whether it's LGBTQI+. There's a wide range of groups, and I think it's just about going to the basics. It's human rights. It's about all humans, and I think that's something that's it is a societal problem, but we're working on it and trying to use the leverage of sports as a powerful tool to make sure that it's embedded across the world.
You made some lovely points there, and kind of pulling out what I suppose has been a success, I suppose in terms of giving some practical advice to the participants today, but you kind of said competition, you've mentioned kind of the governance and the rules around, you mentioned resources, and I think that's really key, is whether there is enough resource and bringing in those expertise from outside. Are there any other key critical factors that we should be looking at to make this happen within different tournaments or events or community clubs? And I suppose that's a question to all three, but
I mean, capacity building is huge. Education and awareness on the topic is huge. A lot of people hear the term human rights and they're scared of it. They don't know what it means. And I think it's important for us as experts, as practitioners, to be able to break that down to people, to let them understand it's actually more simple than what it might seem. And then to be able to empower them through capacity building, positive action schemes, to get them on level footing, to be able to have their voices heard as anybody else. And to have the skills to be able to work on the topic as anybody else. And the minorities don't always have to work on human rights or equality or diversity and inclusion topics. It's really making sure that accountability sits with everyone in the organisation. And I think that's a key way to take things forward. So whether it's the processes for performance evaluation of staff, that diversity and inclusion aspects are included in there. It's definitely accountability at all levels across all sports that need to be pushed forward.
Yeah, I think Hella makes some really great points. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's absolutely right. It's throughout an organisation. I agree with Hella in terms of, I think sometimes it's shoehorned into an HR problem. You know, so what is HR going to do about, you know, what is human resources going to do about all the humans? But you know, it's much more about how do you embed it across the business at all levels. You know, and yeah, I think it is about you know, demystifying some of the things that are really hard to talk about. So, you know, at M&S, we were talking about having conversations and putting together sort of, I guess they were, you know, most corporates love to have like a user guide or some sort of SOP or, you know, standard operating procedure. And it wasn't as cold as that, but it was about saying like some of these conversations are hard and we need to have them though, because we can't keep working on the premise that when we're talking about microaggressions or code switching or, you know, all of these terms, that everyone is aware of what we're talking about, you know. And I think one of the things that we were really keen to address is, you know, the sort of the cover that we take under the sort of idea of banter, you know, so, oh, well, it was just banter. And, you know, some of the things that feel as though they're quite insignificant can actually be a lot more sinister than we think. So yeah, I totally agree. I think it needs to be throughout. I think there needs to be engagement, and I think agency, what Hala was saying, is really important too. So if you do have people in your organization that are part of these discussions, that, you know, so if it is with, you know, people with disabilities, then it's disability led, then, you know, those are the voices that we need to start listening to too. So it's, you know, so I always, like I said, I always go back to the beginning, like who wasn't here and whose voices are we missing? Because I think that's really, really key. And also that each individual's experience is their own, you know, so I think some of the traps we also fall into are, that's one person, the exceptional person becomes the poster child for D&I, and it's like their experience is their own, you know, they're certainly, you know, it's not one collective sort of you know, homogenous group of people, you know, everybody moves through the world differently. So again, I think it's about understanding you know, the nuance that is required. You know, I think a lot of the work that I was doing at M&S, you know, for me, it was about using my platform and acknowledging my privilege, but also saying that, you know, I'm not from the UK, you know, so my experience is very different. I grew up in a very different environment, you know, so it was about sort of also making sure that if you are that voice, that you're still being held accountable to those people that you're representing as well, you know. So, but I think a lot of it is also like, you know, interrogate this up, like hold the mirror up to your organization, to yourself, you know, where are your, you know, where are the bits that you're missing? You know, you talk about blind spots, like what are the pieces of the puzzle that you're not seeing, because you've never had to do it before. So yeah, those are some of the things that, you know, I can suggest.
Yeah, really good. Thank you. Steve, have you got anything to add to that? I mean, between the two, it's very comprehensive, but from what you've seen.
Yeah, I think probably just to take it a bit wider, and actually start thinking as well, if we're talking about fans and spectators, yeah, and also if we're talking about, you know, sport participants in the generalist sense, so that can be, you know, from the occasional swimmer through to elite athlete. I think, unfortunately, there's a question that we just have to ask ourselves: does that person feel safe, right? In ideal world, we really shouldn't have to be asking this question, but too often we do. And I think that's also saying, you know, do children feel safe participating in sports? And I think there's been immense steps on child safeguarding on lots of sports. There's still some blind spots, but we've got to sort of, you know, acknowledge that and work it through. And today is, you know, an important day to talk about that. But also, as far as fans, do they feel safe? So, and I think that kind of analysis of sports event organisers, and I'll give you an example from the work we did with around 2026 sort of bid, which I think, you know, Hala will know the work is starting to happen on this. But one of the things we heard during the stakeholder engagement, we tried to identify around, around that World Cup, which will be enormous because it's an expansion of teams and it's 6 weeks and it's 3 countries. There were different human rights issues in different places. So that natural thing of saying, oh, well, it's about workers building stadiums. Yeah, maybe in Qatar, but all those stadiums are built. So it's about carefully looking at what is the event you're organising and who might be impacted. And when we were doing the stakeholder engagement in Mexico City, something came very clear from women who said in Mexico City at night in crowds, they feel unsafe. Doesn't matter the reason for the crowd. And the concept of being in Mexico City at night in crowds full of drunk men made them significantly less safe. Now, again, if you can predict what you're going to do if you're in the Azteca and you're putting on a World Cup game for, I don't know, Russia versus Serbia, I'm only picking that randomly for no reason in particular, you can see why women who live around that stadium might feel unsafe. And then the response to that was a really good one, was to talk to UN Women to actually start from now piloting concepts of safe streets and control of streets around at nighttime. Now, I think that's a simple lesson that any sports organizer should look at who's coming to it. And I think that safety thing just didn't go to fans. And there's one that I'll leave off on there was, I don't know whether, I mean, I don't know if we've got anybody from the RFU on the line, but there was, you know, the reports that came out as far as the experience of, I'll use their word, not mine, hostesses, as far as actually working within sort of VIP and sort of high cost tickets and entertainment at Twickenham for Six Nations games was horrendous. You know, they worked and they got paid just more minimum wage, but there was this idea, as you said, back to banter, the acceptable banter, what meant they just didn't feel safe. Now, it's quite easy for us to put in stage steps and certain controls to stop that happening. And I think we just have to say, you know, if we start with who doesn't feel safe, then to me, unfortunately, that's the place we start. You start dealing with that, and then you can start at the same time looking at promotion. But look, while we have people who don't feel comfortable either playing, attending, or working at a sporting event, we've got a problem.
Yeah. That was a good point to finish on there. And what I'd like to do now is just put some questions from the attendees over to you guys, if that's all right. So the first one's from Matthew Philpott, and you know, obviously this about the COVID pandemic, and that's obviously had a huge impact on sport financially, both for the major professional ones, but also the grassroots. But obviously it's increased that urgency for change in society around these issues. So what do the panelists think about the financial pressures facing the clubs and so on? And will that curb the potential progress in sport addressing these inequalities? I'll start with Hala, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah, I think it's definitely a relevant question with COVID around the impact that's having on.
It's going to come up somewhere, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're all COVID fatigue from this, but it will have an impact in terms of the tournaments that clubs or national associations will be able to take part in. We already see potential impact on Euros this summer, and it's still a bit unknown as to what's to happen. But I think it's actually a good opportunity as well. Teams can't play to focus on the good work that's being done within these clubs and within these national associations. And these are obviously coming from the Scottish FA at one point in my life where we didn't qualify for very long. That was key to our existence in terms of to talk about the other good stories and the other good work that's happening out with the tournaments. And that was key to driving forward and making an impact within the communities that we were working in. And D&I was one of those main things. And again, one of the main reasons why the diversity and inclusion work started there. So it gives you an opportunity to probably work more with the communities. We've seen the clubs becoming town halls, having a lot more community engagement. And I think one of their key points, whether it does come down to sometimes the commercial business aspect, is to maintain the fans and supporters. And how would they do that? Is to maintain engagement with them and to help them and support them and deliver those food packages and volunteer in different spaces. So again, it's about leveraging that situation to make sure that this topic is actually at the forefront of what we talk about and the opportunities that can be addressed. I mean, while everyone's on pause, it also gives a good opportunity for women's football to catch up and be able to give the sponsors the opportunity to focus on the good stories or the good work that's happening within that sector and leverage themselves as well. So I guess it's the collaboration and understanding that from each side there will be something to gain, and just about finding those points to be able to push it forward.
And kind of like, I suppose, building on that a bit and the kind of the COVID side, but drawing in the politics around this. So this is a question from Wynne Fanshawe, is how can we harness the power of politics to control the agenda, or should we allow politics to exploit the power of sport? And I think what's interesting with COP coming up at the end of the year, you know, there quite a few sports organisations are trying to raise their platform around this, obviously focused on climate, but the sustainability agenda as a whole. So yeah, it would be interesting to get your views on that. I can see Steve smiling, so maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the work we do is, I think that there's much more that we can do and all learn to make human rights a technical issue, to implement it. So let's say if you're looking at a supply chain, and like I said, my colleague Louise has been working with Birmingham on this to do the technical stuff that make it less likely there's labour rights abuses in your supply chain. But at the end of the day, you know, whether we're talking about diversity issues or human rights issues, they are essentially political. You know, both change does and doesn't happen because of politics at the end of the day, small p and big P. So one is, I don't think you can avoid it, and we can take this all the way back to, you know, the tour boycotts of South Africa during apartheid, and way back beyond then. You just can't avoid it. You have to live with it and you have to confront it. Now, I think there's one thing which we've seen recently, and really sort of to think about is around, and we've said, around giving athletes voice and giving athletes freedom to make their political comments. Because, you know, if an athlete honestly makes, you know, a statement on some of the things we've been talking about, that's much stronger than the club making a statement. You know, I'm not saying people don't trust their clubs, but I mean, it has a degree of authenticity that you wouldn't have otherwise. And that's why I think there's a comment in here. We've also got to think about sponsors and TV and others, because again, sometimes when that kind of censorship around politics, it may come from the politicians, right? It depending on the country you're in, but it also may come certainly from clubs and federations, from a feeling of what implicitly, what will our sponsors think if we allow this to be said? So I think honest conversations with the sponsors as well around these issues is quite an important thing to do.
Yeah, I would agree with Steve. I think the notion that you can separate the personal and the political, I quite frankly don't think it exists. And I think if it does, then that speaks to your privilege, you know. So if you're not being impacted by some of the politics of what's happening currently in the world, then that perhaps is speaks to how you move through the world, you know. And I think a lot of this, you know, it can't be separated. I think it needs to be harnessed. I think the question around sponsorship is really interesting. I think some of the, I think that's where the business side comes in. There is a lot of money to also be made if spaces are inclusive. There are whole markets that are not being tapped into because people think that's not for me, that business is not for me, or that product's not for me. So, I think they don't have to be interchangeable. One can, they can exist in tandem. But I do think that there is obviously I'm not taking away from the sort of, I guess, the risk that is taken by athletes standing up as an individual against a collective, which can be quite countercultural, and actually saying as an individual, I think about Naomi Osaka when I think about things like that, in terms of her work around Black Lives Matter throughout many of the high profile tennis tournaments. So yeah, I think it's an absolute power and vehicle for change. But yeah, I don't think we can not have politics involved anymore. I think a lot of what we've learned over the last 18 months is about, lots of our worlds overlapping and merging, right? Our personal and our private, we see each other's houses now and things like that. So I think, a lot of those worlds are, the demarcation is not as apparent as maybe it was in the past. Yeah.
And I think on the sponsorship side that you've both brought up, that's a really interesting point in itself, in that, quite recently sustainability and more the environmental side of it is encouraged. There's more sustainability related sponsorship. And for example, like the Birmingham Commonwealth Games recently, with Severn Trent Water, and the focus being around sustainability and carbon neutral. But where there isn't really any, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I've seen any sponsorship deals that have particularly focused on the human rights element and promoting, enhancing that, being able to talk about it. What are your views on that? Maybe over to Hala and Steve.
Shall I have a go first, Hala? That's not. I think it's harder, because I think, again, having worked, for the last sort of couple of decades in broad sustainability, is quite often, if we're talking about carbon and we're talking on, environmental issues that have a scientific and an implementable aspect, even though there's a political dimension to it, you can kind of measure it, and as a corporate you feel reasonably comfortable. And I think it's back to, John's asked a question in the chat on this as well, as far as ESG, is that you get on with it, sponsor it, you stand up, say we're doing this. I think lots of sponsors, and this may start to happen, of saying, okay, we are going to work with sport to promote diversity or inclusion, or ensure that human rights in the supply chain are sort of dealt with. That's a big, harder ask to get through your legal and marketing, right? Partly because it's non-measurable, or it is measurable, but it's harder to measure. Two is because it can go dreadfully wrong. And also because I think the genuine sort of, world-class marketeers are aware of the fact that they can be accused of virtue signaling. And they may say, well, is that what we're doing here? Is it genuine or is it something else? So I think there's a challenge there. I think it's more of the fact, having a conversation with sponsors to say, you have to accept that this might be a bit difficult, and you go with it. And I'm sure that FIFA has had that conversation with its big sponsors around Qatar, because, let's all face it, both in Qatar and Russia, they were not easy sells at the outset in terms of human rights issues. Yeah. So, and also some of big FIFA sponsors like the Coca-Cola company have very clear statements now as far as human rights is concerned, and have made quite a lot of progress themselves. So,
Hala, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think more recent years in tournaments and going forward as well, it has become a topic from the human rights policy and from the different stakeholders that we engage with, that it is a conversation, it is on the table, it is something that is being discussed. I'm not directly involved in conversations, but I know, for example, where we talk about electric vehicles, being used in charging points and where those would be around the stadiums. Things like that are being discussed. It's maybe not the sole reason for the sponsorship, but it's an expectation of the sponsor from us, but also from them to push us as well. So I think as we go forward and it becomes a topic that a lot of people are aware of, and again, a lot of sponsors want to be seen as inclusive and diverse and environmentally friendly, and hitting all those hot topics. they will use us as leverage to have those things implemented. But for us as FIFA, personally, from a personal perspective, I love seeing those topics talked about and being pushed, and having a reason to have them embedded into the topics and discussions that we're having to push, whether it's different policies, different procedures, how, for example, Qatar Airways considers disabled people and people with limited mobility, their accessibility policies and procedures, and being able to affect those. So I think we will see more of it.
Yeah. I'm conscious we've only got 4 minutes left. So what I know there's some really good questions in the chat, and what I'll do, if you're happy, is I'll put them across to the panel afterwards, and we'll send a little note with the follow-up link of this, I guess. I'm sure we do that. I hope I'm not committing to something that we don't do. But what would be really good just before we end is to hear from each of you just on kind of one final nugget of advice or information for the groups, or if you know, Ben's asked Ben Barrett about whether there's a particular federation, club or sport, or, you know, even art or creatives, or a retailer or whoever that's doing this really well, that's worth Googling afterwards, for example. Yeah, so just to start with Steve.
Okay, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about calling out one specific individual, but I think there are lots of positive examples, and I think a bit of accentuate the positive on this. I think is to do the good news stories and build on those and learn from things. And I think and I think there was a point that I'm just looking in the chat here, actually, who said, I think it's Ben put it in,
yeah,
is, learning from the way other events and how arts do this, I think is important. You know, just on sustainability, is that on a side life, I've had the privilege of 2 times in the last 5 years of playing music at Glastonbury, and you know, as a performer or a fan, going somewhere like that puts down 200,000 people and literally leaves no trace, you know, as far as is really fascinating how they do it, but also the way that there's no arrests, that they, you know, the level of sort of, you know, behavior between individuals in that is really, really interesting. And I think seeing at major soccer tournaments as well, I think there's a lot less stress and tension than everyone thinks they will be. And I think Russia was a good example for that. So I think take the good examples, learn how other people have done. I think, you know, another one that I will call out is, I think, learn, for example, the way that FIFA worked with journalists. And I know there's a press freedom issue here, as far as actually talking to journalists, listening to journalists on Russia, and making sure they had their voice in the country and they could move backwards and forwards. I mean, I think it's fair to say that's probably the one that I'd call out. So pick something that isn't obvious, but is where, if you like, the power to influence lies. Because, you know, if journalists are reporting on sports, quite often they're not just reporting on sport, they're reporting on politics as well, and increasingly so. So again, look for those points of leverage. I think someone's already mentioned leverage on here, and use how, you know, we can use sport, and that might not be the game itself. You know, it may be reporting on the game, or a fan's experience of just being in. It's like my daughter, when she started coming to football again when she was about 13. I said, do you suddenly like football? And she said, no, I just quite like the noise and the songs. And just being, I mean, we'll see what it's like when we go back again after COVID. But, you know, I think just take what's powerful in sport and use that rather than the negative noise. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Just a couple of minutes left. So, Hala.
I think for me, we mentioned this at the beginning, Jessica touched on it, is that individual accountability. So taking the ownership in your own area, whether it's participation in sports, whether it's governance, leadership, planning, whether it's media broadcast, is to take accountability and see how you can affect small bits and how can you can influence others. I think Sarah Green mentioned that she's part of the TV production side of sport, and in terms of editorial deliverables on D&I, get your colleagues as well to kind of make pledges, make commitments, ask leadership how they would choose to challenge. It doesn't have to be only relative to International Women's Day, but it can apply for any of the groups that we work with. And just, I guess set targets for yourself. It doesn't need to be organisational-wide targets, but say in a year's time, this is what I will have achieved, and make yourself accountable. Share it with somebody else, and then come back after a year and see how far you've progressed on the topic.
I love that. Share it with someone else. Yeah. And final point from you, Jess.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said already, but I think just to build on what Hello said, I think there's an individual accountability in your professional life, but that actually starts in your personal life. You know, so I know that a lot of what we bring into our work lives, our office spaces, our Zoom rooms, that's built from how we move through the world and how we look at the world personally. So I think that there's a huge call to, let's educate ourselves, take a personal pledge outside of your work environment to, follow someone different on Instagram, go read a book that's different to what you do, really take on board some of these things as a personal pledge, because that's where the change happens, it really happens sort of in your home, as well as then I think it can overspill into your work life. But yeah, I think it would just, my advice would be, if these are really hard, complicated, systemic changes that need to happen, but there is a real power here of the individual, to really build on that change. So don't be scared, just do something, however small, however private, however public, there is a real call to action there.
Brilliant, very good. So the hour is up. Thank you so much to Steve, Hello and Jess for being part of such an inspiring panel discussion. Thank you to all the participants for the questions. I really, really enjoyed this myself, and there's loads of things that I've taken away personally. Keep us posted on how you're getting on, and feedback is always welcome, so send that to the BASIS account. Just a couple of quick BASIS comments. April is going to be the super month for content from BASIS, and we're going to be delivering an online conference spread across the month with 3 webinars in 3 weeks, and a couple of other meetings. On Wednesday, the 14th of April, we'll be looking at sustainability of sportswear and equipment. On Thursday, the 15th, there'll be a breakfast meeting with colleagues from the Sports Environment Alliance in Australia, and sharing best practice between the 2 organisations. And then, I'm not sure I'm going to read them all, there's loads. 21st, return of recreational sport. So we'll send that out in a note to all the attendees that joined today. Thank you again, everyone. Really amazing, and have a good rest of the afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.